Samueli. It is now 9:11 p.m. in very dark, gray, gloomy city of Budapest, where this weekend things are going to get even gloomier because we turn the clocks back. One of the stupidest exercises ever known to man. We go through this ritual twice a year, completely pointless. Yeah, there it is. So then we're going to lose, however little daylight there already is, we're going to lose what little we have. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody who has joined me. And really appreciate it. So obviously, the big news of the day is so Ahmadovich says, do you hear about the attack on the oil refinery in Hungary? Are we going to see Nord Stream 2, or will Hungary react to what looks like a real act of terrorism? It's very interesting. I mean, there has been an attack on an oil refinery in Hungary, the biggest oil refinery in Hungary, and it's kind of very, very interesting. But it comes the day after the issuance of this threat by the EU that Hungary and Slovakia have got to get themselves off oil from Russia, but quick. And so then, the very next day, there's an attack on an oil refinery. I tend to think that this is indeed an attempt to coerce and intimidate Hungary and Slovakia to basically cut themselves off from oil from Russia and accept the EU offer, which is to get oil by sea via Croatia. This, of course, will be very expensive for the Hungarians, and energy prices here are already very high. And so this will be the Hungarians will just, according to this theory, will say, hey, this isn't worth doing. We need to get our oil from Croatia, just like the EU has said. So the EU issued that statement yesterday, saying by 2027, all EU member states are going to cut themselves off completely from Russian oil, and that applies to Hungary and Slovakia. And then, lo and behold, the very next day, there's an attack on the oil refinery in Hungary. So I do think this is an act of terror. I mean, so far it's under investigation, but I suspect that this is indeed an attempt to coerce Hungary. Now, so today we learned that the upcoming summit, the Trump-Putin summit in Budapest, may not happen after all. So there we were, getting quite excited, thinking that this summit may happen. I remember Trump issued that truth last Thursday, saying, "Oh yeah, we're making, next week we'll have a meeting between Marco Rubio and the Russians." So that would be Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov, and then they will arrange for a summit meeting between Putin and myself, namely Trump, that will take place in Budapest. That was on Thursday evening, my time, but Thursday afternoon in DC. And then the Russians issued a statement shortly afterwards, which was more tentative than Trump's statement. They said that, this meeting could well take place in Budapest. Now, today, the media, of course, jumping all over it and saying, "Oh, the summit is off. It's not going to happen." Now, that really is a very dubious interpretation, because, first of all, the summit hadn't been scheduled, so you can't very well say, well, it's not going to happen if it hasn't even been scheduled. And Marty, introduces himself. Always good to see Marty. And Marty does it with his meme, and the meme is a picture of Zelensky extending his right hand and to Viktor Orban, and then Orban looks at his hand as if that's the hand that he had just sneezed on, or maybe that's the hand he used because the toilet paper had run out in the stalls, so he had to use his hands because he looks at that hand with great distaste. It's not a hand that he wants to touch. Um, so thank you for posting that picture, Marty. And so since it hadn't been scheduled, you can't very well say, "Oh, it's not going to happen," because we didn't even know it was going to happen. But in any case, no formal announcement has been made either from the Russian side or from the American side that there isn't going to be a meeting. At most, we can say that there are no plans in the immediate future for a meeting, but we never really know about that. So here is a Politico. So look at Politico. That they're of course very gleeful, and they say Trump's second meeting with Putin is off. Now that is of course a mischaracterization. We don't know if it's off. First of all, as I say, it was never on, so it can't really be off, since it hadn't been scheduled. But also, no announcement has been made to suggest that there won't be a meeting. So it says here, Russia's foreign minister said he made clear to Secretary of State Marco Rubio in a call on Monday that their demands in Ukraine haven't changed. And then President Donald Trump's second summit with Russian Vladimir Putin is off. No, it's not. The White House said Tuesday that the planned meeting in Budapest, announced by Trump just last week after his 2-hour phone call with Putin, was no longer in the works. Then it says Secretary of State Secretary Rubio and Foreign Minister Lavrov had a productive call, said a White House official granted anonymity to discuss the plans. Therefore, an additional in-person meeting between the Secretary and Foreign Minister is not necessary, and there are no plans for President Trump to meet with President Putin in the immediate future. That only just says there are no plans. It doesn't mean that they're not going to meet. It just says that there are no plans for an immediate meeting. But as I say, Trump, when he made that, sent out that truth last Thursday, only said that there will soon be a meeting, but there was nothing specific. No, he didn't provide any kind of a time frame as to when this meeting would take place. And then the rapid dissolution of plans for another summit between Trump and Putin, just 2 months after they met in Alaska, stemmed again from Russia's refusal to budge from its maximalist position on what it would take for it to halt its war in Ukraine. All this is editorializing. Since no one has made any announcement that the meeting is off, we can't very well say, oh, the meeting is off because of Russia's refusal to budge from its maximalist position. We simply don't know what the issue is. In a press conference on Monday, Lavrov said he informed Rubio that Russia's position that a peace agreement was come before a ceasefire and his war with Ukraine has not changed. So we'll take a look in a minute on what Lavrov actually said. But even as Politico presents it, that's not an unreasonable position. Most states, including Israel, incidentally, say we want a peace agreement first, then we'll have a ceasefire. I mean, well, that's been Israel's position all along. They're not just going to have a ceasefire and then that's it. They say, well, we want some kind of a peace agreement. You may think that the peace agreement is rubbish, but nobody just simply has a ceasefire without something, a framework for something more permanent in place. And here's the Washington Post. White House says no Putin Trump summit anytime soon. And then it says the Trump administration said on Tuesday that there are no plans for President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin to meet in the immediate future, marking an abrupt postponement of a meeting Trump said a few days ago would happen in Hungary. The statement came hours after Russia's top diplomats signaled a wide chasm between Moscow and Washington on ending the war in Ukraine. The Trump administration, in confirming the meeting's postponement, made no mention of a diplomatic row between longtime adversaries, because there was no diplomatic row. And then the White House official says Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Foreign Minister Lavrov had a productive call. Therefore, an additional in-person meeting between the Secretary and Foreign Minister is not necessary, and so on. And then Russia on Tuesday rejected Trump's call to freeze the fighting in Ukraine on the front line, signaling the Kremlin has not significantly changed its demands for peace after Trump said last week that he believed Putin wanted a deal. Well, it all depends on what's in the deal. And then Lavrov said Trump's demand for an immediate ceasefire, which has suddenly become a topic of discussion again, was contrary to what was agreed at the Trump-Putin summit in Alaska in August, when Trump abandoned his pressure on Putin to end the fighting ahead of negotiations. But I mean, there's a little point in applying pressure. No one's actually going to do that. Anyway, then this you see the thing about Trump. I mean, if you go back to last week. So last week he has this phone conversation with Putin on Thursday, just ahead of the meeting with Zelensky. So the phone conversation goes well. Trump announces that there'll be this meeting between Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov, and then there'll be this summit in Budapest between Trump and Putin. Now, and so that was then, and then of course the next day Zelensky arrives, and then Trump goes out of his way to humiliate Zelensky. The humiliation began with the administration's refusal to send anyone to meet him at the airport. I mean, he's a visiting president, not just a president who's supposed to be a close ally of the United States, a president on whose behalf Western civilization is fighting, and on whose fate the fate of Western civilization hangs. And so no one actually bothers to show up to meet him at the airport. And then he goes to the White House. He doesn't get a meeting in the Oval Office, so that's already another humiliation. He's hauled into the cabinet room, and then he has Trump kind of making fun of him. We're saying, hey, we need these these Tomahawk missiles ourselves. Can't really afford to let any of them go. And then he has Trump taunting him about this great idea of let's build a tunnel linking the Russian Federation to Alaska. And then he asks Zelensky, how do you like that idea? I don't like it at all. So Trump went out of his way to humiliate Zelensky, and showing Zelensky basically that he's worn out his welcome, to say the least. But then, and this was really kind of interesting, that he sent out this truth which wasn't really in accord with the spirit of the meeting. The spirit of the meeting was, we need peace now. I mean, Putin wants a peace. Trump, want a peace. Zelensky wants a peace. We can get this done. But instead of that, he sends out this truth, where he seems to revert back to a position that has obviously been rejected by the Russians. So this is what he sent out. This was on Friday evening, after the meeting. He says, the meeting with President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine was very interesting and cordial. But I told him, as I likewise strongly suggested to President Putin, that it is time to stop the killing and make a deal. Enough blood has been shed, with property lines being defined by war and guts. They should stop where they are. So this is, they should stop where they are. Then this, they should stop where they are, is, of course, that's the position of the coalition of the willing, America's NATO allies. So a ceasefire in place, and then we use the ceasefire in order to boost Ukraine, send arms, money, weapons, everything, to Ukraine, in order to start this whole thing up again in 5 years' time. So he was here going back to that NATO position. And what he did at Alaska, which was, I think, the what the Russians called the breakthrough in Alaska, was that he had abandoned the demand for a ceasefire in place. That was what the the NATO powers wanted, the ceasefire in place. Trump abandoned it. He didn't make any kind of demand for a ceasefire in place, and so the Russians thought, well, that was a breakthrough. And then, but here he's going back to the ceasefire in place. They should stop where they are. Let both claim victory. Let history decide. No more shooting, no more death, no more vast and unsustainable sums of money spent. This is a war that would never have started if I were president. Thousands of people being slaughtered each and every week. No more. Go home to your families in peace. So from the Russians' perspective, that was clearly a step backwards, because they thought that in Alaska, they'd heard the last of these demands, that there be a ceasefire in place. They said, well, we have no interest in a ceasefire in place, and Trump no longer insisted on it. So now he's going back to that. And it seemed that was, at least, I mean, Zelensky had come to Washington expecting all kinds of goodies, top prize being the Tomahawk missiles, but he was expecting Patriot anti-missile systems and all kinds of nice weaponry. He didn't really get anything, and the media reported that the meeting had not gone well. But as often happens with Trump, he kind of takes a few steps in one direction, and then he goes and takes a few steps in the opposite direction. So, having essentially humiliated Zelensky, having made clear that Zelensky is a supplicant, that he's really very, very tired of the supplicant constantly coming to Washington demanding one thing after another, and trying to drag America into a war in which America has no interest in, and in which Trump personally has no interest. And that is a consistent theme of his. Trump personally has no interest in this war. He thinks it's a stupid war. He doesn't understand what the hell it's about, and that it should come to an end. So he has no interest, and Zelensky comes there and just wants to keep this war going. So he made that clear during the meeting with Zelensky on Friday. But then he sends this truth out, which clearly was at least a sop for Zelensky. Zelensky didn't get the weapon system he wanted. He didn't get his tomahawks, but at least he got Trump echoing his line that we should freeze the conflict in place. And that's something that that will warm the cockles of the heart of the NATO gang. And so today, the NATO gang, or the coalition of the willing, issued, as is their wont and as was to be expected, they issued a statement. And this is well. First of all, let me just before that we get to the statement. Yesterday we had that phone conversation between Rubio and Lavrov. Now, as you can see from the readouts, both from Rubio and from Lavrov, that it's the conversation was pretty, let's say, pretty icy. It doesn't seem like it went anywhere. Here is it says, this is from the State Department. The below is attributable to Principal Deputy Spokesperson Tommy Pigott. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke today with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to discuss next steps following the October the 6th call between President Trump and President Putin. The secretary emphasized the importance of upcoming engagements as an opportunity for Moscow and Washington to collaborate on advancing a durable resolution of the Russia-Ukraine war in line with President Trump's vision. So what is it? The importance of upcoming engagements as an opportunity for Moscow and Washington to collaborate on advancing a durable resolution in line with President Trump's vision. Well, I don't know, because I mean, you have to say Russia may have its own ideas about the resolution of the Russia-Ukraine war, and it may not be in line with President Trump's vision. And it more or less kind of gobbledygook. I mean, it doesn't really say anything. And then here was the Russian readout, which normally is quite detailed, or usually much more detailed than the American readout. But here is the telephone conversation between Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, U.S. Secretary of State Miguel Rubio. On October the 20th, telephone conversation, a constructive discussion took place on possible concrete steps to implement the understandings reached during the telephone conversation between Russian President Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump on October the 16th. So this is very different. See what the Americans said. Emphasize the importance of upcoming engagements as an opportunity for Moscow and Washington to collaborate on advancing a durable resolution of the Russia-Ukraine war in line with President Trump's vision. It has to be in line with his vision. And then they said the possible concrete steps to implement the understandings reached during the telephone conversation between Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump. So it's not about, in line with President Trump's vision, but to implement the understandings reached between Russian President Putin and Donald Trump. But we don't actually know exactly what were those understandings. But anyway, this is the coalition of the willing. We were waiting really from Thursday onwards. I mean, ever since the Trump announced that he had a phone conversation with Putin, likely meeting in Budapest, we were waiting for the coalition of the willing to make their mark. I mean, they're bound to step in. They're bound to say, we don't want this, and we certainly don't want it in Budapest with that awful, horrible person Viktor Orban, Putin's best friend in Europe, presiding over the proceedings. So we were waiting. Well, when are they going to issue their I don't know, their statement of condemnation? And so here it is. This is the joint statement from on behalf of a number of governments. 21st of October, 2025. Statement by President Zelensky, Prime Minister Starmer, Chancellor Merz, President Macron, Prime Minister Maloney, Prime Minister Tusk, President von der Leyen. She is not bloody president of anything. I mean, you call her a president. She is not bloody president. I mean, all of those people, at least, are, whatever their shortcomings, at least they were elected to their positions. But, President von der Leyen, president, elected to nothing. No one, Europe, they don't recognize her as, the president. And then President Costa, he's the president of the Council of Europe, he's also not a president. Prime Minister Story, President Stubb, Prime Minister Frederiksen. She's that Dane, the stupidest leader currently in Europe. That's a tough. The competition for that is very intense. It's a sort of it's a little like the sort of the world tennis competition. Whether it's Novak Djokovic and his peers, who is going to be the champion stupidest person in Europe. But at the moment, Frederiksen is firmly in the lead. Prime Minister Sanchez. Sanchez is the one that irks Trump. He's the Prime Minister of Spain, so much so that Trump is threatening Spain with sanctions or tariffs because Spain pointedly refuses to contribute more funds into NATO. And then Prime Minister Kristersson, he's a Swede. So anyway, on peace for Ukraine, and it says, we are all united in our desire for a just and lasting peace deserved by the people of Ukraine. We strongly support President Trump's position that the fighting should stop immediately. And you notice that was the key. They picked up on this, on what Trump had said in that truth. Oh, that's Trump's position. The fighting should stop immediately. I mean, it wasn't his position for weeks and weeks. It wasn't his position coming out of Alaska. And he didn't say anything like that on Friday until he sent out that truth. And that the current line of contact should be the starting point of negotiations. Why should it be? I mean, there's no reason at all. No one just simply has a ceasefire and then begins negotiating on the basis of a ceasefire and thereby giving their adversary a nice, comfortable breathing space. We remain committed to the principle that international borders must not be changed by force, except, of course, when we do it. But we can change international borders by force because we are on the side of good. And Russia's stalling tactics have shown time and time again that Ukraine is the only party serious about peace. We can all see that Putin continues to choose violence and destruction. So, but if Putin continues to choose violence and destruction, then why are you just calling for an immediate ceasefire? I mean, it stands to reason that Putin, who only wants violence and destruction, would use a ceasefire to go on perpetrating violence and destruction. So you can see the dishonesty involved here, that they have no intention whatsoever of abiding by any kind of a ceasefire. They've used that as an interim period to prepare for an armed confrontation with Russia. Therefore, we are clear that Ukraine must be in the strongest possible position before, during, and after any ceasefire. So now, they must be in the strongest possible position. So you 1 minute you're talking about the ceasefire, freezing everything in place. But Ukraine must be in the strongest possible position. We must ramp up the pressure on Russia's economy and its defense industry until Putin is ready to make peace. That's very peace-like. We are developing measures to use the full value of Russia's immobilized sovereign assets so that Ukraine has the resources it needs. So they're flatly coming out and declaring, and there was no surprise there that they're declaring that they will seize those frozen assets and hand over the money, not all of it right away, but hand over the money to Ukraine. Very, very interesting that all of that money will be handed over to Ukraine to purchase weapons from the Europeans. So then, in other words, that the money will be fueling either the European defense industry or fueling the American defense industry. This is Russian money that belongs to the Russian people. That it will be used to for the arms manufacturers of Europe and the arms manufacturers of the United States. So it won't actually go to the Ukrainian people. I mean, even if it did go to the Ukrainian people, it would still be theft. But the idea that they're going to steal this money, this is Russians' money, hand it over to the arms manufacturers, and so as to produce weapons that will be used to kill Russians. So Russians will be spending their own money for weapons that will be used to kill Russians. And then they come up with this convoluted nonsense. Somehow, well, what about paying this money back? Because after all, the Russians are going to say, we want our money back. This is our money. And then they say, well, we'll give this money back when Russia pays restitution to Ukraine. Well, of course, Russia isn't going to pay any restitution to Ukraine. So they're not going to give any of this money back. Now, that is obviously outright theft. And the Europeans figure that the courts will rule in their favor. I mean, if they're European courts, they probably will rule in their favor, though I don't know on what legal basis they will rule in their favor, because this is property that obviously belongs to Russia. You can't just simply, it undermines the very principle of any kind of a banking system when you put money into a bank and then the bank manager says, thank you very much, that'll do nicely, and I'm going to use it for whatever purpose I want to use it. And particularly in this case, you're going to use it in order to kill Russians. But this is how they rationalize. But clearly, by the fact that they issue this statement and already saying that's what they intend to do, then that's what they're going to do. And so the statement then goes on. He says, leaders will meet later this week in the European Council and in the Coalition of the Willing format to discuss how to take this work forward and to further support Ukraine. Now, as we've said many, many times before, the reason why these creatures, these Coalition of the Willing types, are doing what they're doing is that they want this war to continue. That's the goal. They want this war to continue in order to weaken, destabilize, and destroy ultimately Russia. And the thing is, I've argued now in recent weeks, the plan, I think, is to soften up, weaken Russia for another 3-4 years, after which time, when Russia will have already been fighting this war for 8 years, after which time Russia will have been so weakened and demoralized that NATO can make its move, and that NATO can then wage its war against Russia. I think that's the strategy that NATO is playing. That's not Trump's strategy. I think it's the strategy played by the Macron and Starmer and Merz. They want a full scale war between NATO and Russia, not now, but a few years from now, when Russia will have been sufficiently weakened, and that's why they're always very anxious. They were anxious at the time of the Alaska meeting that Trump might somehow find a way to end this war, and they were anxious now ahead of this supposed Budapest meeting. So they issued this statement today ahead of the sort of White House announcement saying, well, there are no immediate plans for this Trump Putin meeting, but they issued it ahead of time because they wanted to make clear we don't like it. We absolutely are dead set against any such meeting. So now let's take a look at what Lavrov said today at he gave this. He was at a news conference with the foreign minister of Ethiopia, and naturally he was asked about this the summit, and you know, it's interesting just trying to discern. Lavrov is not an easy you know you know he talks, you know, a lot of very windy stuff, so it's not always easy to figure out what he's saying. Anyway, he's asked, "How are the preparations progressing for the upcoming Russian-American summit in Budapest?" And then Lavrov says, "Yesterday I spoke in sufficient detail with Secretary of State Marco Rubio in accordance with the agreement reached by the presidents of Russia and the US on October the 16th. We confirmed our firm commitment to moving in accordance with the understandings and agreements reached between President Putin and Donald Trump, primarily in Alaska, during their telephone contacts." Now, Lavrov often talks about this, these understandings that were reached in Alaska. And it's hard always to figure out what were these understandings, because there was no joint news conference, if you recall, no joint news conference after that meeting. The meeting was pretty short. You know, it was a long trip for both presidents to get to Anchorage. The meeting was short, and there was no lunch afterwards. So you know, what were those understandings? And Lavrov sort of spells it out. Um, not particularly satisfactorily, but it does spell it out here. And it says, Marco Rubio and I discussed the current situation and how we can prepare a version of the next meeting agreed upon in principle between the presidents of Russia and the United States, which the US president proposed to hold in Budapest. Clearly, the issue isn't about the location, although the location is also important in this situation, given the uproar raised by those who don't want to see the European Union as a union of sovereign states, but rather want all. So who wants to see European Union as a union of sovereign states? Well, that's obviously Viktor Orban wants that. Robert Fico wants that. But clearly, that is not the vision of Ursula von der Leyen, who want their centralized, top-down, bureaucratic, authoritarian European superstate, but rather want all issues resolved within the confines of Brussels bureaucracy. The most important thing, after all, isn't the location or the timing, but how we will move forward on the substantive objectives agreed upon and on which broad understanding was reached in Anchorage. So again, second time he says that we were agreed upon something in Anchorage. We agreed to continue these telephone contacts to better understand where we are and how we move in the right direction. And then it says, today I was surprised to read that As reported by CNN, the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump may be postponed. Since after our conversation yesterday with Marco Rubio, American officials came to the conclusion that Russia's position has hardly changed in the time that has passed since then and remains within the limits of its initial maximalist demands. Um, I don't get to the conclusion. Yeah. Okay. So, like, it's not clear how what he's saying. He's saying that is, I think he's paraphrasing the CNN story, which is kind of similar to the stories from Politico and the Washington Post that we read out earlier. The dishonesty of many Western media outlets is well known. CNN is notorious for it too. Of course, it is. They're generally not inclined towards serious analytical work, preferring instead to offer simple slogans that are thrown and forced upon the recipient. I would like to officially confirm that Russia has not changed its position compared to the understandings um, reached during the lengthy negotiations between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump in Alaska. Third time he said this about these understandings in Alaska. Um, these understandings are based on the agreements reached then, which President Donald Trump succinctly formulated when he said that a long term sustainable peace is needed, not an immediate ceasefire that will lead nowhere. We remain fully committed to this formula. I reaffirmed it yesterday in a conversation with Manuel. I think this is just garbled. So the key here, as you can see, is that Trump had as his first acceptance. I think when he said the understandings, you begin to see what does he mean by these understandings, which is that a ceasefire by itself is quite pointless, and that Trump seemed to understand, and he did indeed say that after the meeting in Alaska, that there's very little point in having a ceasefire if it's just going to last for 24 hours. So we need a lasting settlement, which is kind of obviously what the Russians, the it was, yeah, just Nick. So George, don't scare us with that black and white thumbnail. I don't know what that means. I don't know what the black and white thumbnail is. But I like the idea of a black and white thumbnail. Anyway, so then so Lavrov is saying, Trump clearly understands that there has to be a basis for a lasting settlement. And that just these ad hoc ceasefires just won't get us anywhere. And then he says, now we're hearing from Washington that we need to stop immediately, that we shouldn't discuss anything anymore, and let history judge. So now, having said, you see this, he says, we're hearing from Washington and let history judge. But that was that's he's quoting Trump's truth here. So he's saying first, on the one hand, oh well, we had these understandings with Trump in Alaska, but now he's saying, oh well, we need to stop immediately, and we shouldn't discuss anything anymore, and let history judge. And they're saying, well, so Trump, they're kind of saying it's Trump who has changed his view. Well, big surprise. Yeah, Trump doesn't stick to any one particular position at any time. So then Lavrov goes on, simply stopping would mean forgetting the root causes of this conflict, which the American administration, since Donald Trump's rise to power, has clearly understood and voiced. So now again, he's going back to saying, oh, the Trump seemed to understand about about the root causes of the conflict. I'm talking about ensuring Ukraine's non-aligned, neutral, and nuclear-free status, which presupposes abandoning any attempts to draw it into NATO. Now, the problem with that is, of course, the Russians' position and has consistently been Russia's position. The problem is, I haven't heard Trump ever articulating that. I mean, he has said at various times it was a stupid idea to try to drag Ukraine into NATO. Um, but he's never really spelled out and say, yeah, this is the, the United States should accept that as a reasonable position. That's something, it doesn't affect us in any negative way at all. Ukraine is non-aligned, neutral, nuclear-free, and not in NATO. So that may upset Starmer, Mark Rutte, Merz, and the rest. It shouldn't upset. It shouldn't upset them. It shouldn't upset anybody, since Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, and that therefore, if this is just simply formalized that it's not a member of NATO, it will simply be a neutral state, neutral, non-aligned state. And that shouldn't affect anyone adversely, and that it's actually shows the aggressiveness on the part of NATO in claiming that somehow this adversely affects NATO's interest in having Ukraine outside of it, because that basically is just proof that NATO is indeed an aggressive organization, and that's why it wants Ukraine inside NATO. I'm talking about ending the de facto genocide of the Russian and Russian-speaking population, which the Kiev regime has been engaging in since before Zelensky came to power. Back then, they legislated against every conceivable right of the national minority, as it is formally considered in Ukraine. But in reality, the majority of Ukraine's population speaks and thinks Russian. Banning the Russian language in all spheres of life is an absolutely Nazi-like regime. Zelensky himself has long sought this. Okay, so that's, love of familiar themes from him. Then he says, some time ago, French President Emmanuel Macron, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Karen Starmer, I don't know where they get the Karen Starmer, and European Commissioner President William von der Leyen. I think these translation services, I think they leave something to be desired. William von der Leyen stopped mentioning the need to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. They began calling for an immediate ceasefire. Okay, so that is indeed the case. They started calling for an immediate ceasefire only after Trump became president, because of course Trump became president and immediately he started talking about bringing this war to an end. I mean, he promised during the campaign he would get it done in 24 hours, but even if it's not 24 hours, he was going to get it done. So they knew, these NATO powers, that Trump was going to make a push to end this war. And so suddenly they changed their position. Lavrov is absolutely right here. They changed their position from seeking to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. They changed their position to, we need an immediate ceasefire. Immediate ceasefire. That's it. That was became the new mantra. So all that time, this is 3 years, essentially 3 years. NATO had no interest in bringing this war to an end. Absolutely no interest. 3 years, no interest at all. Then, once Trump became president, they suddenly feigned an interest in ending the war, but ending it in a particularly tendentious way, which is, an immediate ceasefire. And so that was the key. So, we want a ceasefire. I remember. And then suddenly Zelensky himself started talking about meeting with Putin. Oh, he's going to meet with, I got to meet with Putin. This after Ukraine had passed legislation saying forbidding any negotiations with Putin. Ukraine, this was the Ukrainian legislature, passed a law forbidding any negotiations with Putin, and then suddenly Zelensky is saying, "Oh, I gotta meet Putin. Guys, I gotta sit down with Putin." Um, and anyway, so Lavrov goes on. So sometime after, this is strategic defeat, began to call for an immediate ceasefire. Moreover, French President Emmanuel Macron stated that this ceasefire must be without any preconditions. He meant, among other things, he stated this publicly, that no one would be able to restrict arms supplies to the Kiev regime. As the saying is, the cap is on the fire. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously, that's it. I mean, there's no restriction. In other words, that we're going to keep arming the Kiev regime. And then, but most importantly, a ceasefire would not only mean the opportunity to rearm the Kiev regime, but also encourage its terrorist activities, such as attacks on civilian infrastructure and civilians in the Russian Federation, such as explosions on the Nord Stream project. Yep. Well, we discussed a couple of days ago about how Poland has decided to release a Ukrainian suspect wanted by the Germans for alleged involvement in the in the bombing of Nord Stream, because they said, "Hey, this is justifiable. This is an act of resistance." The Poles are still provoking Zelensky and his team to continue such activities. They justified this terrorist attack on Nord Stream. The Poles are also ready to commit terrorist acts themselves. I heard that Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski threatened the safety of Vladimir Putin's plane that would not be insured if it was sent through Polish airspace to Budapest for the proposed summit with Donald Trump. Yeah, Sikorski did indeed threaten Putin's plane. It's not clear what he was going to do. Whether they're going to bring it down, they're going to shoot it down. But yeah, he did indeed threaten. I guess to arrest Putin should he cross Polish airspace. So an official Polish court has ruled justifying the terrorist attack on Nord Stream. And now the Polish foreign ministry is saying that if the Polish court so requests, they will obstruct the free passage of the Russian leader's plane. They are quite telling cases. They are. But I repeat, an immediate ceasefire, which is suddenly being discussed again, as opposed to the need to resolve the essence of the problem and eliminate its root causes, would now mean only one thing: that a huge part of Ukraine remains under the control of a Nazi regime. It would be the only place on earth where an entire language is legally banned, not to mention that it is the official language of the UN, the language spoken by the majority of the population. This is what those who have now begun to persuade our American colleagues to change their position, and instead of seeking a long-term sustainable settlement, simply propose to stop and let history judge later want. We know who is doing this. It is the European patrons and masters of Zelensky, but this approach is the complete opposite of what President Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump agreed on in Anchorage. Yet again, the agreements in Anchorage, where they agreed to focus on root causes and the need to stop dragging Ukraine into NATO and fully ensure the legitimate rights of the Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian population. We remain committed to continuing this work. Now, you can see what he's doing here. He's saying that somehow, it was Trump himself, who sent out that truth about freezing the conflict in place. And it was Trump himself who said, well, let history decide. Those were Trump's words. But then he says, oh, well, that wasn't really those aren't really Trump's real thoughts. This was, he was persuaded to say this by the NATO's European members, and of course Zelensky himself. But that's not really the real Trump, according to Lavrov, is the Trump who showed up at Anchorage and came to these understandings in Anchorage. Um, this is kind of still is surprising because we really didn't hear very much about any understandings that were reached in Anchorage. And indeed, Trump, after Anchorage, seemed to become quite hostile to Russia. That was, he came back, he seemed to be in a positive frame of mind, and then he started sending out all these quite nasty truths about Putin, about how that Russia's failing, Russia's a paper tiger, Russia's unable to defeat an adversary that he should have finished off in 3 days. So it's hard to identify any moment when there was a kind of a spirit of Anchorage that propelled Trump forward. And it's true that there have been times when Trump did say that, NATO expansion was not a great idea. Trying to cajole Ukraine into NATO was not a great idea. It was going to be, the Russians were really going to get very upset about this. But the problem is that, he said that, but he also said other things. He said about the paper tiger thing, and he if the Financial Times is to be believed, in that meeting on Friday with Zelensky, he berated Zelensky, saying, "Well, Russia can destroy your country. If they want, they can just destroy you. So, why not settle?" So ultimately, you're still left with which is the real Trump, because Trump just seems to go one way one day and then another way the next. Now, maybe there's a kind of method to this, but it's not. It's hard to see what the method is. And it doesn't look to me like Lavrov seems to see what the method is to Trump's madness. So Lavrov wants to, because the Russians want to separate the United States from Europe, they somehow want to elevate and beautify Trump, and of course then to criticize and badmouth the Europeans. But ultimately, it's unlikely to succeed because I think America and Europe are joined at the hip. NATO is the mechanism which joins them at the hip. I mean, a lot of people have tried to separate the Americans from the Europeans. Although the Soviet Union used to do that during the Cold War, but it never worked. And I don't think it's going to work now. I mean, they tried that during the days of the Willy Brandt Ostpolitik. They tried to do that in the 1980s as a kind of reaction against Ronald Reagan's belligerence, that the Europeans thought that this was putting them into danger. And so they tried this, but it didn't work in the 70s and in the 80s. And it's not really working now. Ultimately, Trump just simply hasn't got his hands around this. He hasn't really tried to figure out what will he settle for. What is the kind of agreement for this war? What that he would that would bring this war to an end in a way in which both Russia and Ukraine can walk away with some sense that their goals have been accomplished. Now, the only way and I think we've talked about this with Peter, is if you take seriously Russia's security concerns. Now, no one in NATO has done that. No one in NATO at all has done that. They pointedly refuse ever to entertain the notion that Russia has security needs, and that Russia has reason to fear NATO ensconcing itself on Russia's western border. That somehow that's not a legitimate fear. And I mean, unless Trump can grasp that, then this could just go on forever. He can be nice with Putin one day, and then nice with Zelensky the next day. That isn't going to get anywhere. Because this is just a merry-go-round. We can just go on like this forever. And that's why I thought that some people have criticized me because I was taking an unnecessarily or uh, optimistic view of Budapest, because I thought, well, if they've actually agreed to meet, that means there's an agenda to discuss. So therefore, the Russians will have heard from Trump that he's willing to discuss Russia's real security concerns. That's all. That's all they already want. That Trump will understand that Russia has real security concerns. But in if it was a matter of just freezing the conflict in place, then that doesn't really get anywhere, because then you say, okay, well that's just a ceasefire in place, and then we start this whole thing up, again in a few years' time. That doesn't address it. So when Trump sent that truth out on Friday evening, that was of course very, very disappointing, because after all the hopes for Budapest, after the hopes of the sort of the dress down of Zelensky, then we're back to where we were. We were back to where we were in the early summer of this year, with this ridiculous ceasefire proposal. And so the one other thing I want to show is that Lavrov gave an interview to Kommersant a few days ago, and he said there's an interesting thing there, because he was asked, precisely on this issue. You keep talking about these agreements that were reached in Anchorage. What were these agreements? And so he says, after the Alaska summit, many were expecting to see progress on the Ukrainian track, if not a breakthrough. The initial signs were promising, but now we're seeing a rollback, with US President Donald Trump threatening to supply Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. What is happening? And then he says, I would not call it a breakthrough. It was a lengthy conversation aimed at mutual understanding. I have said repeatedly that President Donald Trump and his team are, in fact, the only representatives from the Western camp, and frankly beyond it, who have publicly addressed the root causes of the conflict. It's not just that they use the term, they and Donald Trump personally try to look deeply into their essence. Drawing Ukraine into NATO is one such root cause. President Trump has stated multiple times that this was Joe Biden's error, one that must be corrected and must not and not allowed to happen. Similarly, when President Trump and Witkoff began discussing issues of territory and demarcation, that represented as a reality. And then in Alaska, the president discussed how to move forward, taking these two root causes into account: NATO expansion and the fate of the people in the territories developed by Russians, to which the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev now threatens to claim. So it's interesting how he has defined the issue. We know about the NATO expansion, or we know that, but he's doing something interesting here, because he's talking about the aspirations of those people in Ukraine, those Russian speakers. So in a way, he's saying, I mean, he hasn't really articulated very well, but he's saying that I mean, so he's not articulated in a way that a Western audience would understand, but that somehow they have their own sort of human rights are being denied by the Ukrainian regime. That Russia has, in a sense, taken over these territories because the human rights of those people has been have been denied. So this isn't about acquiring new territory. This isn't about Russian expansionism, because as I think Putin has said, look, Russia doesn't need any new territory. Russia has plenty of territory. So it's a huge country, biggest by far in the world. Rich in resources, rich in agriculture. So Russia doesn't really need additional territory. So what they're doing in Ukraine is to protect the human rights of the Russian speakers, um, and in the face of this Ukrainian Nazi whatever regime. So it's, in a way, it's kind of going back to a particular idea of nationalism. It's not about territory; it's about the culture, language, self-determination of a people, and that is what nationalism is about. It's not really about territory; it's about realizing the national aspirations of people. Now, I think it would have been nice if Russia had made that clearer long ago. They haven't made that clear, but I think that's what he's saying. Well, those so he's saying that Trump understands this, and it may be that they talked and talked in Anchorage, and Trump said, "Yeah, okay, I understand you," um, but I don't know that Trump really did understand this, because it's like he's not interested in things like that. That's just not that's just not who he is. And So then it says, to return to Alaska, those present cannot disclose the details for obvious reasons. But the essence was that President Putin brought a response to the proposals delivered to Moscow a couple of weeks earlier by Steve Witkoff. President Putin had taken time to consider them, and in Alaska, he stated his readiness to agree with the concept Witkoff had brought primarily. To the concept Witkoff had brought primarily because it reflected an understanding of the root causes and aimed to eliminate them. In fact, he outlined how, after accepting this concept, it could be brought to fruition. Um, so we don't really know what any of that was about, and that created that whole confusion, if you recall, about what it was Witkoff seemed to understand that the Russians were willing to give up, or the Russians were insisting upon. So that wasn't at all clear. So it may be that Witkoff had kind of misunderstood what the Russians were saying, and then had led Marco Rubio to think, oh, the Russians are willing to give up territory in Ukraine, which is not really what the Russians were saying. So I think Witkoff probably did misunderstand what he had been told. And here, I think just a little bit more. Um, and yeah, that's it. So that was his interview with Commerçant. Then you can see again what exactly he means by these understandings that were reached with Trump. Now the thing is, where do we go from here? And it's hard to know. Trump is mercurial, but it's unlikely that there's going to be a meeting unless there is something much more specific to discuss. And at the very minimum, I think the Russians will expect the American team to take seriously Russia's security concerns, which is that's really the key to it. And in other words, I imagine this discussion, this phone conversation between Rubio and Lavrov really didn't get anywhere, and that's why kind of Lavrov seemed to be rather disparaging about that conversation. Having said that, as I've said many times here before, that ultimately this war is Russia's to win. We can preoccupy ourselves with Trump this and Trump that and so on, but it's Russia's war. It's not America's war. It's Russia that has to win this war, and Russia has to win this war and achieve at least some of the objectives that it set out for itself in February 2022. And so that's why when we listen to the Mearsheimer, and they spend all their time criticizing Trump, and that's fine. I mean, as I say, I mean, I'm skeptical about Trump. I don't know how much Trump understands any of these issues. I doubt whether he does. I think because he has no ideological commitment to NATO, to the whole notion of global democracy and so on. But none of that interests him. He has no Russophobic ideas, Western expansionism and destroying Russia and taking territory away from Russia, whatever. He has none of that. No, none. But that doesn't mean that he understands what this conflict is about. But it's still a matter that when Mearsheimer, I mean, I always pick on him because he's supposed to be this great man, this great professor, blah blah. But he keeps criticizing Trump, but it doesn't matter what Trump is doing. It's Russia that has to win this war. It's Russia's war to win. Irrespective of anything that Trump does, Russia has to win this war, and it has to do whatever is necessary to win this war. Because if it doesn't, if the war drags on, because essentially what's happening now is just playing into the hands of NATO. NATO is just simply biding its time and preparing for this war with Russia. They're not ready now, but they will be ready in a few years' time. So they're biding their time, and the longer it drags on, the more self-confident NATO will become that they can defeat Russia in 4 or 5 years' time. And I think that's the seriousness of it. So we, just simply saying, "Oh, Russia's winning this war. Russia's winning." Yeah, but there's no winning in a war. There's no winning. You either win or you don't win. And if you don't win, then you're opening yourself up to a serious attack from your adversary. So, I just find Mearsheimer's commentary completely vapid. So, anyway, let's take a look at our locals board, where the Gagglers, the people who are members of our community, the people who take seriously the meaning of this community, and essentially they keep. I put this picture of myself there. I don't think it's very good, And that's, I think, what somebody said about the black and white print. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. So I don't know what people think about that. I don't think I'm going to keep that there. Anyway, thank you everybody who are members of our community and who care about the dogs and the frustration that the dogs feel when they're not fed and looked after properly. So Dennis Misty, thank you very much, Dennis, says Trump Putin meeting in Budapest is not nice. Says Kaya Kallas. It's not nice. Yes, I mean, you can you imagine, as far as Kaya Kallas goes, three of the people that she hates most in the world would be in located in a place that she hates in the world. So Orban, Trump, Putin. She hates all three, and they'll all be located in Budapest. So yeah, it's not nice. No, no, I don't want any of that. Um, and then so that I just saw. It's not nice. Definitely not nice. Robert, welcome, Robert. Always good to see you. And Robert, in response to Dennis's message, says the EU should just go ahead and make their slogan, "All we are saying is give war a chance." Yeah, I think so. That's exactly their position. That's why they, in response, they were really angry when they were gleefully anticipating the meeting with Zelensky on Friday, in which Zelensky would walk away, with pockets stuffed with promises of deliveries of tomahawks, with these Patriot missile defense systems. It'll be fantastic. We've got our war. We've got Trump where we want him. He's now committed. He will have crossed the Rubicon, and there's no going back. Once he's done that, once he's delivered those tomahawks, there's no going back. There's no way that there can be any more peace initiatives. And they thought they had it, and then suddenly Trump came along with that shock of the telephone call with Putin, and then the promise of the meeting in Budapest. And maybe Trump just did that in order to wind up the Europeans, knowing how upset they would be at the idea that he was going to go to Budapest and hang out with his good friend Viktor Orban and, of course, Vladimir Putin. And that he just did it in order to wind up the Europeans. It's hard to know. Always hard to know what's going on in Trump's mind. But as as things are, it's hard to see what the pattern here is. I mean, at least in the case of the Middle East, so far he's got a ceasefire in place of sorts. We'll see whether that lasts. Everything hangs on whether they move on to phase two. If there's no move to phase two, if we're still arguing about implementing phase one, whether Hamas has done this or Hamas has done that, then we're not going to get anywhere. The ceasefire will break down, as sure as night follows day. And then we have Marty, and then Marty then shows this is the meeting of in Hostage Square with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. That was the meeting when they mentioned the name of Bibi Netanyahu, and then the crowd, went into an almighty booing of Netanyahu. So whereas they cheered at the name of Trump and said thank you Trump, but Netanyahu, the booing just wouldn't stop. It was kind of embarrassing because, of course, when it came to Jared Kushner, Bibi Netanyahu is a family friend. Anne Marie, thank you very much. Always very good to see you. Anne Marie, as I always say, is our resident musical expert, a distinguished musician. Was we're very fortunate to have her here. She's played in some of the finest orchestras in the world, worked with some of the leading conductors, composers, and artists of the 20th and 21st centuries, and has experience of music from the inside, from the experience of how to play it, what music means to the actual creator, to the actual artist. So it's always a privilege to enjoy Anne Marie's commentary for the musical pieces that we publish here on the Gaggle. And this week I posted Sibelius's Third Symphony, which I think is, I think is one of his greatest symphony. And I'm hoping that Anne Marie will have the time to weigh in and tell us what she thinks of the Third Symphony in particular, but also generally of Sibelius. I think Sibelius is I think one of the greatest. We've already posted a couple of works by Sibelius, and so he's you know he's a remarkable composer, and kind of it makes you think. When we talk about Alexander Stubb and the Finn chick, this is what Finland has become. Whereas back in the olden days, I used to associate Finland with Sibelius. I thought, I kind of liked Finland because, well, oh, Finland, yeah, Sibelius. And then, of course, the other thing were those great middle distance runners, the Pavel Nurmi. And then, of course, a later generation was Lasse Viren, who won 5,000 and 10,000 meters in two successive Olympic Games. And so that's what I used to think about Finland, but no more. But anyway, thank you so much, Anne Marie, and I hope very much you'll have the time to say something about Sibelius's Third Symphony. Thank you. And Robert says here, just as Oscar Wilde quipped that the public school system had no effect whatever, the same has proved true in the case of the federal government shutdown. Yes, it's very, very interesting that this government shutdown's now has been going on for week after week, and nothing really very much changes as a consequence. We're going through this. We're always promised that there's going to be an almighty crisis, but there's nothing. Nothing very much is happening. Uh, uh, which kind of is instructive of just how little use we have for the federal government. Um, and so yeah, that's it's quite remarkable. Um, I want to know, Robert, what's happening in your race in New Jersey, the gubernatorial race. You may have seen that Trump issued a long truth about the gubernatorial race. I think he did it, maybe he did it either today or yesterday. Um, so he's really weighing in now on this race. So I'm curious how this race is shaping up, and what you think about Trump's intervention in the New Jersey race. I thought when you brought up Oscar Wilde, you were going to say he had a great quip about I'm paraphrasing. I can't remember the exact wording, but says nobody has any use for good advice, which is why the only use anyone puts and the only use anyone has for good advice is to pass it on to someone else. Which I also was very clever. I mean, he framed it rather better, but that's it. Like, nobody has any use for good advice, other than to pass it on to someone else. Um, and that's right. So, and yeah, that's all right. Let's go back then. See if there's anything further. The Well, no, Julie says a nice picture. Oh, thank you very much. I wasn't very sure about that, but it's let's see if I can see if we can. Nah, I was hoping that I could go back a little bit earlier, but it's very hard to um, uh, to move this up on the live chat. Okay. Um, okay. So anyway, as far as just quickly, sort of just to wrap up, in the Middle East is concerned, we have the vice president who is in Israel today, and the question then is, are we really going to get to the phase two of the plan? This was always the bit where the previous agreements collapsed because Israel, of course, never wanted to go to phase two. They like the phase one part. Yeah, yeah, we get our hostages out. Now they're making an issue of the um, the remains of the dead hostages. Obviously, they want to make it seem as if Hamas is violating the agreement, um, but they never have any intention of moving to phase two. And so the question then is, will Trump have the the determination to move to that? In other words, will he actually press Israel to move towards phase two? And I guess you'd have to say, um, your guess is as good as mine. Um, he Trump today sent out a a truth about the Middle East, and here's um, because it's apropos of the meeting um, in Israel with Vice President Vance. He says numerous of our now great allies in the Middle East and areas surrounding the Middle East have explicitly and strongly, with great enthusiasm, informed me that they would welcome the opportunity, at my request, to go into Gaza with a heavy force and straighten out Hamas if Hamas continues to act badly in violation of their agreement with us. So this is um, already kind of a little problematic, as if suggesting that Hamas is continuing to act badly and that Hamas is in any kind of violation of anything. No evidence, incidentally, that Hamas is in violation of any agreement. It's returning the remains of the dead hostages. It's not able to get at all of the remains because they are buried under rubble, and Hamas does not have the excavation equipment to, you know, dig up the bodies. So Hamas is doing what it can, and has now returned, I think, something like half of the remains of the dead hostages. So there's no evidence Hamas is violating anything. Um, Now he's saying about these allies, now great allies in the Middle East, who would welcome the opportunity at my request to go into Gaza with heavy force and straighten out Hamas if Hamas continues to act badly. Well, that isn't quite what the deal envisaged. I mean, the deal envisaged um, going in as the international security force. It's not going in, to attack Hamas. That isn't the plan. I mean, you could certainly say that part of the deal, of the 20-point plan, the understanding of the 20-point plan, and the Sharm el Sheikh declaration, that implicit in the Sharm el Sheikh declaration is that um, that Hamas will be restrained by Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt, that they will act to restrain, but only under the condition that the United States agrees to restrain Israel. So they I think are willing to restrain Hamas. They will say we will take over the running of Hamas. They will be answerable to us. We will keep Hamas under control, but only under the condition that you keep Israel under the control. I think that was the implicit understanding of the Sharm el Sheikh declaration. Um, um, so I want to take a look at this. Going back to the our, where are we? Um, huh, no, it's not. I thought I'd. Um, let's see. We have this. I can't seem to get. And I was trying to click onto the Anne Marie's. She's posted something from a video of Trump, but I don't. I can't get at it. Um, see if I can. This is always difficult with these things. No, I can't. I wanted to click on it, but I can't seem to be able to. Anne Marie, could you try again to post it on the locals page? Maybe then I can click on it and then and watch it. Um, anyway, but I think that um, so anyway, Robert says, let's see, can I do this? Okay, okay, now I can try it. So waiting. Here's Donald Trump posting an AI video showing him literally dumping stuff on America. Let's see. Okay, it says Trump wearing a crown. Yeah, this is, yeah. No. Yes. All right. Well, that's not nice. That's not nice, as Kaya Kalas would say. Um, I haven't I haven't seen this. It's a little disgusting. I mean, I think generally anything involving excrement is not nice. Um, whereas I thought the one that he did um, on the shutdown of government, and then he had the kind of as if Mexican uh, singers with the forgotten the name for Hakeem Jeffrey, doing the whole this Mexican singers. I thought that was hilarious. Um, well, it's him in a jet releasing some brown liquid. Yeah, I don't want to speculate too much what that brown liquid is, but Mr. Stone River says a hilarious meme. I guess it's for everyone's taste. I mean, I don't find that particularly hilarious because I don't know, excrement's always a little bit uh, little bit hard to take. As I say, I thought the one you did on Hakeem Jeffrey with the Maricano singers, or the way they were. I thought that was that was funny. Um, this I thought particularly wasn't particularly funny. But the problem with Trump is you can't. There's no way you can expect good taste from him. I mean, he has always been, ever since his emergence on the scene. I mean, way back, in the 1970s, 80s, he's always been a vulgarian. He's always, with his gold faucets and mirrors on ceilings and everything. I mean, that's who he is. But anyway, the what I was just saying, going back to the truth that he sent out, the international security force, and it's true that a number of states are interested in taking part in this international security force, which is part of the phase two of the peace plan. Um, they they are willing to take part, but they're not willing to be used against Hamas. That's absolutely not the agreement that as they understood it. Because what they would say, yeah, okay, we will step in to maintain order, but you're not going to use us in order to disarm Hamas. In other words, to do Israel's dirty work for them. As if somehow, oh, that's good. So Israel doesn't have to do it. We can get the international security force to do it for us. They're not going to agree to that. There's no one. They're not going in. Turkey's not going to go in and straighten out Hamas for Israel. So again, Trump is kind of undercutting his own accomplishments. So he did this thing, the 20-point plan, the Sharm el Sheikh declaration. He said, okay, these are his accomplishments, and now he's kind of undermining his own accomplishments by expecting this international security force to go in and straighten out Hamas. That wasn't the deal. As I say, they are willing to restrain Hamas, but only as long as the United States restrains Israel. That's the deal. We'll take care of Hamas if you take care of Israel. But if Israel is just running rampant, then they're not going to take care of Hamas for Israel. And as they will point out, Hamas has not broken the deal. They haven't violated the ceasefire. And so he says, the love and spirit for the Middle East has not been seen like this in 1,000 years, the usual Trump stuff. In 1,000 years, it is a beautiful thing to behold. I told those countries in Israel, not yet. Not yet. There is still hope that Hamas will do what is right. Do what are they supposed to do? What is right? If they do not, an end to Hamas will be fast, furious, and brutal. Now, the thing is with this, as Trump realized just a few days ago, that if you just try to destroy Hamas, first of all, it's not possible to do it. Israel has been doing it for 2 years and has failed to do so. But even if it were possible to destroy Hamas, all you're going to accomplish is create a Gaza Strip in which there's no law and no order. What Israel has been doing all this time, which is destroying the not just the physical infrastructure of the Gaza Strip, but the civil infrastructure, that simply is no law and order. And that's where, into this vacuum created by Israel's bombing, of course, you had all these gangsters and looters, rapists, and everyone just filling the vacuum, all incidentally supported by Israel. Israel supported all of these rival gangs in order to challenge the power of Hamas. So even if it were possible to destroy, wipe Hamas off the face of the earth, Trump's not going to do it if Israel hadn't been able to do it for 2 years. Even if you were able to do that, you're just going to create complete, absolute anarchy in Gaza. There'll be nobody to maintain order. There'll be nobody to make sure that food is distributed. There'll be nobody to make sure that the sewage works are working, that there's clean water, the hospitals are functioning. I mean, these are all things that Hamas actually does. So for Trump to talk like this, oh, we're going to get these our good friends in the Middle East are going to go in and attack Hamas for us, and they're not going to do it. They're just simply not going to. That's it. And then there'll be no phase two. And if Trump thinks that he's going to send American forces in, well, the Americans aren't going to do it either. So then he'll be left to send in Israel. And then, in other words, we're back to where we started. And that's the end of your big uh, pitch for being the peace president. Well, you're not the peace president. That's it. The war continues. Um, so here he is. It seems when he sends this truth out that he hasn't understood what he himself had accomplished. That wasn't part of the 20-point plan. These international security force were not going to go in to straighten out Hamas. They were there to provide security for everyone on the Gaza Strip. Anyway, so not yet. So not yet. There's still hope that Hamas will do what is right. If they do not, an end to Hamas will be fast, furious, and brutal. I would like to thank all of those countries that called to help. Also, I would like to thank the great and powerful country of Indonesia and its wonderful leader for all of the help they've shown to the great Middle East, USA, and thank you for your attention to this matter. But as I say, this will not happen. No one's going to go in. They're not going to go in to fight Hamas. They're not going to go in and have Israel start shooting at them. Um, you know, unless Trump takes this seriously, I think Trump actually restrains Israel, which is what all of these powers, what Sisi expects of him, what Erdogan expects of him, that he restrains Israel. Then it's not gonna work. Then there isn't going to be an international security force, and if there's no international security force, then there is no phase two of the peace plan. So it's it was Stone River who seemed to like that the meme. As I say, I mean, I've liked some of Trump's memes. I didn't think this was one of his better ones, but it's never nice, when you have brown liquid being dumped on people. Anyway, I think my time is up. Thank you, everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for all of your comments and questions and insights. Thank you above all to those who put money into the tip jar, because dogs, they'll be waking up quite soon. They like to get up early, and first thing they do, check the tip jar, lousy, and then they take out their anger on me because it's obviously always my fault. So anyway, but thank you everyone who nonetheless contributed to the tip jar. Really appreciate it. It's what enables us to do the work we do here. So thank you. We will be back on Thursday, and we hope that there'll be better news. I mean, I think this has been kind of a bad day all around. So I hope there'll be at least some better news on Thursday. Look forward to seeing you then. Until then, all the best. Good night. Bye-bye.